For the past few hundred years, the West was able to set the international rules. But now other parts of the world, especially Asia, want a voice. How is Asia going to change the rules? I'm really glad that you could join us for Asia Talk here in Beijing's Art District 798, Qijiuba. What are Asian values? Are they really that different from those in the West? Our guest today is a Malaysian entrepreneur and intellectual that represents a new Asia, and he has a lot to say about this. Welcome to Beijing, Chandran Nair. Pleasure.
Good to meet you. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm living now for 15 years in China, but I don't really understand the concept of Asian values. Can you explain it to me?
I'm not sure I understand either. So, but let me just say that I think the concept of Asian values has been grossly exaggerated. I think it's a play on a wider stage of perhaps both geopolitical as well as social issues about the differences.
So there are no Asian values?
Well, the problem I have with this notion of Asian values or Western values is that the proponents of either one suggest that one is superior to the other. And I think that's a danger. I think certainly there are differences in the way people appreciate certain things based on culture, based on religion, and based on the political economy. And therefore there are differences in ways people make decisions and the way people think. But I would be loath to suggest that there's an Asian value which is in any way superior to the West, or also accept that Western values are superior to Asian values.
Was it a certain insecurity which brought up this Asian values things in Asia, probably? The idea that you have to get something against Western values?
I think it's probably a mixture of both insecurity as well as perhaps an element of arrogance and a feeling of the re-emergence of Asia, and therefore trying to capture that emergence by suggesting that Asian values were somehow inherently better suited to some of the challenges of the 21st century. So I think it's both a mixture of arrogance, insecurity, but also political sort of dialogue going on between the East and the West.
But if you get into the details, the Western politicians basically, they say that the Asians are dealing with human rights, for example, in a different way, that they have a different idea of human rights.
I could argue that there are huge differences between the definitions of human rights in the West too, between Western nations as well, between the Anglo-Saxon world and the non-Anglo-Saxon world. Clearly there are differences, but I think those differences are not so much in disrespecting human rights, but understanding at which stage in the development of these nations people can take on certain sort of
Can you
actions.
give an example?
Well, for instance, the whole issue of the freedom to protest, which seems to be sacrosanct in some Western nations, but in parts of Asia are seen as not that important. So that would be a difference. And you could argue that in certain nations in Asia, the right to just protest for the sake of protest, which is a hard-earned privilege in the West, perhaps doesn't suit.
But isn't it just
Asia
a point? Yeah, but isn't it just a point for dictators to keep in power? That they say, "Oh, we don't like protests."
Oh, you sound like one of those commentators on TV. I really don't think it's about dictatorship. I think it's really about understanding the complex nature of the diverse nature of both the cultures, the socio-economic issues, etc., and the stage of political development as well. And I think it's quite arrogant of some in the West to suggest that just because the right to protest is perhaps not as freely granted in this part of the world, that therefore there is a disrespect for human rights.
So it's just a different stage of development. So at the end, they're going to go the same way we went already in the Western countries?
I don't know if it's going to go the same way that the West has gone, because some would argue that the United States of America, for instance, has taken a step back in terms of freedom of speech. I mean, if you or I went to the US today and said some radical things, I think we'd be stopped. So I'm not sure what the trajectory is for the West or for Asia, but clearly there are challenges in terms of where the regions are. And I mean, I'm sure you are aware that within Asia too, there are diverse range of political systems, etc. You can protest all you like in India, get nothing done perhaps, but you can't protest perhaps in China as much. So I think there are differences within the region as well.
So then there are no Asian values. There are Chinese values,
yes,
Indian values.
Absolutely different values. I think the Japanese person is as different in terms of value systems from the Indonesian as the Thai person is as different from someone from Germany.
So is it more difficult to unify Asia than to unify Europe?
Well, I don't think there's an argument for unifying Asia.
Why not?
Why would you want to unify Asia?
Because you're stronger.
Country. Well, but the countries are so large that it's a myth to suggest that firstly the region will unify in one bloc, and I don't think it's necessarily a good thing, and it will not happen because it's such a large, diverse region.
Why it's not a good thing to stick together, to work together, to exchange their goods and all this kind of things?
Yeah, but that would be something
like we do in Europe.
Well, that would be something that you would try and stick together as a global community, in my view, rather than as regional blocks and trying to face off in a kind of all-world order, we in Asia against the Europeans and the Americans. I think that is extremely dangerous, it's old-fashioned, and it should not be pursued or entertained in any way.
Anyways, China is very strong in Asia. Mm-hmm. Probably the country which is dominating Asia. Is it a bad thing that one strong country is really running the show? If you compare it to Europe, where you have like 2 to 3 countries?
Yeah, but I mean, China is clearly the largest economy in Japan is the largest economy in Asia, as you know, and China is very dominant. But China is dominant on a global stage. I mean, as you know, the links with China and the US matter more than China's links with India or the rest of Asia.
Sure.
So I don't think it's necessary. I certainly agree with you that it would be an awful world in which we had a China or a US dominating the world. And I think that's going to be the difference in the 21st century, a more sort of benign relationships between large nations in which they bring together the most secondary countries, which are smaller, but are going to be very important economic partners.
So you really think there will be a multipolar world order?
I don't know whether that's going to be the reality, but it's clearly what I believe will be better for the world.
Why?
Rather than strong, because I do think strong regional blocs create a lot of tensions. And certainly from an Asian point of view, and maybe in Europe, a strong European entity is the path that has been taken over the last 25, 30 years. I don't see it as being realistic at all in Asia. I think you'll get blocs like the Southeast Asian countries, which are smaller, but to suggest that there's going to be a bloc in Asia, which China, India, and all the rest together, is I think, naive.
You have a quite global career already behind you. You were born in Malaysia, mm-hmm. and you were the first kid who could study abroad. How many sisters and brothers do you have?
I have 4 sisters and 3 brothers.
And they're all still in Malaysia?
No, I think I've got one brother in the UK, one in Singapore, and the rest are in Malaysia.
You went to study to England. Why?
Why? Because I couldn't get into the best universities at home. It was easier to get into.
Why it was so difficult?
Well, because there were limitations in the amount of universities we had. There were limited places in the. I wanted to do engineering, and there were limited places. So, being part of a colony as well, being previously a colony of the UK, there were historical ties, and many of us who either could not get in or could afford it found a way to go. I could not afford it, but couldn't get in locally, so found a way to take a loan and go and study. Yeah.
And you moved to England. What was surprising when you moved there?
I think the 2 surprising things were the awful weather. How it got dark.
You were
at 3
freezing.
o'clock. But I think most seriously, I think the most interesting thing was, it's still seared in my mind, is seeing white English men doing the work of laborers. Because my whole childhood, with my parents working for the colonial government, etc., was in which the Brits were always the bosses. So although we knew that the world had changed, actually to see people digging railroad tracks and stuff like that, that was quite interesting.
Was it satisfying, or did it make
No. I mean, I think it was just an interesting insight, clearly into the way. But there's no. I mean, I certainly don't think there's any underlying sort of resentment of any of these things, because I think that's actually quite counterproductive.
You studied biochemistry, how do you call it?
Biochemical engineering.
Yeah, biochemical engineering. It's quite unusual, huh? Why did you do it?
Well, you know, when you're 21, you don't know what you want to do. Someone told me it might be a good thing to do.
And was it a good thing?
I think so. I mean, I think you go to university to get an education, not so much to specialize, but to get a broader view of the world. For me, going to Europe was, you know, one of the best things I did, to go and see the world and get to know different perspectives. So yeah, it was great.
And then you worked in the ultra-clear water field. This water is used for nuclear power station. What did you do there?
Well, the work I'd done, the degree I had in biochemical engineering looked at ultra-pure water systems, and desperately needing to pay off all my debt as a poor student, I needed a job. And so I got a job in London with a company that was involved in pure water systems and purification, and I was involved in some of the research and development work but they were not just used for nuclear plants, they were used for industrial purposes, etc. And it was good training as well, technically as well as professionally.
And when you got rid of your debt, you moved to Swaziland to fight against apartheid. Why that?
Well, I mean, fighting against apartheid might be a generalization, but I wanted to go to Africa because I had a lot of friends from South Africa, and those were the bad old days when Nelson Mandela was, I believe, still called a terrorist. And so I went to Southern Africa, and the place that I could get in closest was Swaziland. Carrying a Malaysian passport, in those days I couldn't go into South Africa because Malaysia was one of the few countries that didn't recognize South Africa, so I couldn't go in, though I managed to get in later on through other means.
Why didn't you stay in Africa?
Why? I spent 5 years there. I did quite a lot of work in the development side, mainly on water supply and sanitation, and a couple of reasons. One, I felt that much of the development aid that was being passed into Africa was actually not doing very much. I found far too many development workers, etc., who had good intentions, but perhaps were not sensitive enough to the impact that they were having locally. And I saw a real disconnect between the needs and the aspirations of the people and the aid that was coming in.
And then and then you moved back to Hong Kong, or you moved to Hong Kong and you took over a little environmental consulting firm, and this firm was kind of growing within a few years.
Yes.
Well, how big was it when you sold it?
Well, I joined the firm when it was about 10 people. I then grew it to about 500 people in 12 countries, 23 offices, etc. And it was part of a global company. I was the chairman for the region. And in 2004, I decided to sell my interest, my stock in the company, and go and do some other things.
Why? Were you bored?
Yeah, I think it was a combination of being bored, a combination of also believing that one should not stick around too long doing the same thing, and a huge interest to take on the sort of work I'm doing now. Mainly believing that I think far too many Asians are quiet, don't speak enough about some of the big issues, and I thought people like me, who had the privilege of a worldview, who had perhaps a tendency to be outspoken, should sort of indulge.
Why do they not speak, the Asians? Why are there so few people?
I think there's two reasons. One is the tyranny of English. So if you can't speak good English, then you don't get pulled up to speak. The second, I think, that there's still a sort of hangover from the colonial era where people are reluctant to speak up. And then there's the cultural sort of trait which says, don't argue. You meet two Australians, they'll always argue and call each other names, but there's rarely would a Japanese or a Chinese person do this. And I think, whilst those traits are important, I think it has really allowed for a predominance of mainly Anglo-Saxon views about the world to dominate the intellectual space. And I think there's a need for people from Asia to contribute to that, and I don't mean just challenging it, but to contribute to that debate.
Is that the reason why you established GIFT, the Global Institute for Tomorrow?
Yes.
And what does this institute do? It's a very nice name, but it's hard to imagine what's behind it.
Well, yes, it is. It is a bit of a hybrid. We'll see over the next few years whether we succeed. But very simply put, we call ourselves a social ventures think tank. So I think, put simply, it's a think to do tank. So we do what is sort of the typical thing that think tanks do, which is speak, write, and engage in some of the international discourse.
Just another think tank?
Well, exactly not. So,
why?
Because what I'm interested in is actually doing, and one of the things two things that we're trying to do is we've launched a Global Young Leaders Program, which is one of the first of its kind. It's becoming internationally recognized. But more importantly, one of the things we're doing is then also creating a platform for social investments to take money from within the region, which much of it, I believe, from wealthy individuals is squandered, to look at how to create a whole new asset class of investments in the region to address some of the most pressing problems of the world. So to move beyond receiving development aid and to move beyond just philanthropic efforts to try and solve these problems, but to look them as actually an opportunity for investments and to change the rules. So that's what we're trying to do.
From a Western perspective, most of the Asian businessmen are interested in making money, and they don't care so much about changing the world, about climate, about development problems. Is this the right perception?
I don't think it's an accurate perception. I would argue that, particularly about that, all businessmen, whether Western or not, tend to be sort of myopic and caught in this old world. I think the Western business people have got better PR, and that's rather sophisticated. But having said that, I think you do have a point. But I think there's still a mentality in Asia of catching up. So you'll find Indian businessmen, etc., all still feeling they have a point to prove, and in China, etc., to catch up. And that, I think, we will see a trend towards shifting towards a more wider view of the world. And I think it's incumbent on people like us to engage them in those wider discussions about climate, social issues, constraints, limits to growth, and those issues. Yeah.
So how do we have to change the world?
Well, I will not pretend to have an answer to that question at all. But what I will tell you is that I think in this part of the world at least, firstly, I'd like to see a lot more Asian business leaders, etc., be a lot clearer about what's going on, rather than timidly subscribe to the conventional wisdom. So let me give you an example. At the moment, post-financial crisis, the leading Western economists have all said to us, please consume more. I would like to see the leadership in this part of the world, both political and business, basically tackle that point very clearly and suggest that with 4 billion people peaking at 5.5 billion in 2050, if we all consume the way consumption is, levels of consumption in the West, the game's over.
But China was giving money to America that they could still consume, and they're still giving money to them. So
yes,
they are part of the game. It's not Asia against Western countries.
No, well, I mean, in the financial economy, in the globalization of finance, that's what's happening. But that doesn't move the world around. And I think, understanding that there's still 500 million people in this country who earn, you probably know the facts better, but give or take $1 here or there, $4 or $5 a month. So I think there's a great difference between the interconnectedness of global finance and the future of these countries in terms of addressing root poverty issues, climate and resource issues. Similarly for India as well.
But at the end, they don't care. The people in India and China, they all want to have their own cars, their own refrigerators, and they want to probably fly around to Thailand for holidays. So who's going to stop them to do this?
Well, that's precisely the point. I don't think you can say they don't care. I think that everyone's made to believe you can have everything. Okay, so we've lived it through a 50-year period in this part of the world during which we believed that the Western economic model of consumption-led capitalism will be the future. I think anyone who's looking at the facts closely, particularly the science in terms of resource issues, will understand that can't happen. So, to answer your question, the reality is that all these people in China and India who want all of these things will not have them. And the political leadership needs to prepare people to understand we can't have it.
But they won't accept. They will say, why can't we have a car and all the Westerners drive 3 cars in America?
Yeah, and that's absolutely right. And that's where the challenge for the 21st century is. Whether people accept it or not, the reality is there's not going to be enough. So, coming back to the kind of political systems we have, the political leadership will need to deal with this problem sooner rather than later because they can't have it. And if they can't have it whilst believing they can, then there's going to be huge social disruption, disappointment in terms of expectations not being met. I think the smart leadership will have to start looking at alternative ways in which people's aspirations are met, which is beyond the ownership of 3 cars or a big house.
But if you want to have a car, then you feel betrayed if you don't get it.
And so what's the point? There
will be a revolution. People will be on the streets. There will be demonstrations.
I don't really think that we'll come to that point before we come to the point where it'll be understood there'll be not enough fuel to drive these cars. So either we deal with the disruption in a very well-managed process, and there will be, as you say, dashed expectations. I don't think they'll lead to revolutions on the streets, but it'll be a gradual transition to moving people around. I think people will accept that they might have a car, but they can't drive it every day, provided the public transport is better, and that's the future.
Will there be a compromise at the end that the West only can have half the amount of cars in America and Europe, that Asian countries, people in Asian countries can have more cars? Is this a solution, or how does it work?
I think a compromise suggests that there'll be some agreement. I don't think there'll be any agreements. The point will be that this part of the world, with the majority of the world's population, will have to deal with the reality that we can't have, with the current projections are that by 2030 or 2050 even, Asia will, just between China and India, there will be 1.5 billion cars. This cannot happen, mainly because there will not be enough fuel to drive these cars. So something will have to happen. But will that be a compromise in terms of international agreements? Of course not.
But if we go away from cars and go to other products, still in Asia, most of the products you buy in Europe or in America are produced here. So if this is going to stop, what's going to happen?
No, I'm not suggesting that things will all stop at all. I mean, I'm not talking about going back to the caves. And we're not suggesting that we should not have economic prosperity. What I'm suggesting is economic prosperity will be defined quite differently from the way it has been described now. The main consequence of the economic model we've done is we've practiced over the last 30 years has been the impact of underpricing externalities. We have to price externalities, and therefore things will change.
Are you a socialist or capitalist?
I don't go by labels.
But if I'm listening to what you were saying, I get the impression that you're probably not pro free trade, that you also want to limit trade developments between Asia and America. Is this right? Or Western countries in general?
No, I mean, the point I was trying to make in an article I recently wrote was that there is no such thing as free trade anyway. All trade is governed by rules, okay? But many of the rules today favor the ability for people to trade in anything. The reality is that we're at a point in human history at which we'll have to curb certain elements of trade. We already do. For instance, we don't allow the trading in ivory because we don't want people to kill elephants. We've done that late. The European Union is about to ban all trading in bluefin tuna. 25 years late, but they're doing it. So we better come to understand that certain things should not be traded. Some things cannot be traded. And the concept that everything is up to be traded is completely naive and a lie. So that's what I'm saying. And the dogma of free trade, I think, has allowed this sort of belief that you can trade everything and anything. And I think we live in a world where some things are going to be sacrosanct. We can't trade certain things, or we limit the amount we can trade.
It's a real pity we're running out of time. Thanks for coming on the show, Chandran. And don't forget, as the Chinese are saying, 慢走, walk slowly.